Now, the Canadian military almost 4 years ago uncovered supporters of two far-right movements within a unit of the Canadian Rangers, but allowed them to continue serving. A CBC News investigation has found the military's counterintelligence branch singled out a pair of reservists, one of whom was interviewed about online posts involving the Soldiers of Odin and the 3% movement. The discovery of the case has prompted an internal investigation by the Department of National Defence. The CBC's Murray Brewster has the exclusive details on this. Hi, Murray.
Hi.
Thanks very much for being here. So this was, I know, a joint investigation with our colleague Elizabeth Thompson. Tell us about what the two of you found.
Well, it started out, Vashi, with us looking into the 4th Canadian Ranger Group, which is the group that Corey Hearn, the man who is accused of driving into the gates at Rideau Hall and making threats against the Prime Minister. We wanted to know a little bit more about that group, but what we uncovered really surprised us. We uncovered support and supporters of two far-right groups. You've mentioned the Soldiers of Odin and the 3% movement. Now, let's break them down a little bit because they are somewhat different. The 3%ers are an American-based, originally, group that are supporters of gun rights. They're libertarians, they're survivalists, but they are deemed by experts to be among the most dangerous of the far-right groups in the country, mostly because they're armed. The Soldiers of Odin began in Finland, and they are an anti-immigrant group, and they are considered by some groups like Canada's Anti-Hate Network as a hate group. So what we uncovered were posts of support, particularly by two people, Eric Miglin and his wife, Jody. And now we've reached out to both of them. We went to talk to, we tried to talk to Eric. He initially said that he would provide us with some kind of statement, an explanation, but then just disappeared. And some of the posts have been wrapped up in gun rights, but also some of the posts have been stridently anti-government. And one of the posts talked significantly, calling the Prime Minister a treasonous bastard. And in the Canadian military, people are allowed to have their opinions, but they're not allowed to have opinions publicly. And the support for the 3% movement and for far-right groups has something that's preoccupied the military a great deal lately. It's at the center of their anti-hate policy and their policy on inclusiveness that was released earlier this summer. Now, what's interesting about this is that the counterintelligence branch, and we have proof of this, investigated and actually interviewed Eric Miglin, but he was allowed to stay.
That's what I don't get. Yeah.
Well, we don't get it either, and we've asked the military about it, and we've got really no substantive answer as to why. And particularly when you see some of the posts, it's open, it's not hidden. And this has been going on for years. So we have asked what the situation was. And what has prompted the defense minister to begin looking into this as well, because
there's an investigation.
There is an investigation now, and Harjit Sajjan was noticeably upset when all of this and all of the material was brought to his attention. He said that he was only advised about this when CBC News began asking questions about Eric Miglin and about some of the posts that have been seen online, and. You know, it's significant in the sense that the Canadian military has dealt with these kinds of allegations behind closed doors. They've tried to rehabilitate people. We've talked about the Proud Boys. We've talked about some suspected members of the Boogaloos. But this is now out in the open. And if there was an attempt, at least according to experts, if there was an attempt to rehabilitate him, it didn't work. In fact, if you look at some of the posts, as early this year, he is actually conversing with senior leadership of the 3% movement and essentially telling them what was said with CF counterintelligence. So we'll have more tonight on the National.
Yeah, I'm really looking for, and that's years after the initial sighting.
This is years afterwards.
That's
yes.
Fascinating. Well, I look forward to your coverage on the National tonight. That's the CBC's Murray Brewster. For more now on this story and those two far-right organizations Murray named, I'm joined by Jessica Davis. She's a former strategic analyst with CSIS and now president of Inside Threat Intelligence, and she's in Ottawa. Hi, Jessica. Good to see you.
Hi, Bashi.
I want to start off with the group that Murray started off talking about, the 3 percenters. What can you tell us about the 3 percenters?
Right. So the 3 percenters do draw their origins from the United States. So the 3 percenters are a group that, claim that only 3% of Americans took up arms against in the American Civil War. And they are stridently pro-gun rights. And in Canada, that's basically the same thing that we're seeing here. They're very pro-guns. The only thing that I would say that's a little bit different here is that we have seen some indications of some members of the 3% movement being interested in potentially taking things a little bit further than some of the other far-right groups in Canada that we've seen so far. So some of them have talked about trying to wake Canada up by engaging in some type of violence. So there is a lot of concern about this group here in Canada.
And what about the prevalence of it? Like, how much do we know about how prevalent it is?
It's really difficult to say sort of across the far-right ecosphere in general about how prevalent the members of these organizations are. Because really what we're talking about here is a far-right movement with small sort of cells or individual groups of people that come and go and move between the different groups. There's a lot of splintering and fracturing that happens within the movement. So at any given time, there may be hundreds, there may be thousands who all have different levels of engagement with the movement and membership in one or more of the different smaller groups that exist.
The other group that Murray mentioned and that we hear more often is the Soldiers of Odin. How do they differ from the 3 percenters and what are they about?
Yeah, so we really see very common themes across all of these movements. The 3%, the Soldiers of Odin, are a little bit different because they engage in a little bit of different activities. So they're known for doing things like community patrols, so safety patrols, as they call it, in basically racialized communities. So trying to provide an additional layer of what is essentially vigilante safety in these communities. They also provide so-called security at far-right protests, often dealing with counter-protesters as well. So they all take on a little bit of a different role, but there's an awful lot of consistency across the board. And that consistency extends to maybe things that people are more familiar with, like the Yellow Vest movement here in Canada.
And what do we know about the overlap with the military, or the prevalence, I should say, I guess more specifically, of these types of far-right groups in the military? Because that was the really startling part of Murray's story, right? Like, this all started because of Corey Huron, who, of course, like his investigation, I should say, all started because of Corey Huron and everything that he's accused of doing involving targeting the Prime Minister and, running into the gates of Rideau Hall. How much of this is going on in the military? How much do we know about?
We know about very little, and I think that's the cause for concern. I think that right now we're dealing with a lack of transparency from the military with regard to the prevalence of these groups and these ideologies within the military. And that's what concerns me and probably most people here, is just not understanding or getting a sense from the military about what they're doing about it and how much of a problem this really is.
And what do you think that deserves further investigation? Do you think it has to be more public? I mean, I remember interviewing General Vance, I think it was even last summer, in which, some of these other stories were coming out, not even involving what we're talking about right now. And there was a pledge to investigate racism more generally in the military. Not a huge amount of concrete things we're in the middle of a pandemic, so okay. But, there hasn't been a huge amount of stuff that's come from that since. Like, what should they be doing?
I think the first step really is probably to talk to their German counterparts. So the Germans have had a pretty serious extreme right and neo-Nazi problem in their military that's come to light over the last few years. There's probably a lot of lessons learned that the Canadian military could be reaching out to them for, in terms of identifying the individuals, how to deal with the problem in general, and really how to take action on it. I think that, the government and the military really needs to be a lot more transparent about this, because we don't want to be in a situation a few years down the road where we find out that this was much more significant than, the couple of cases that we've seen so far. These are people who have specialized training, access to weapons, access to equipment, and in these far-right movements have expressed a visceral hatred for the Prime Minister.
Yeah, I want to delve into that a little bit with you, because I think the current context, in the current context we should, and by that I mean what happened at Rideau Hall. On the specific case that Murray was talking about, we know that Eric Migland, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, made those posts supporting both the 3%ers and the Soldiers of Odin, including a photo of himself wearing the symbols of both organizations. He also described the Prime Minister as a, quote, and I'm quoting here, treasonous bastard in a Twitter post. And I wanted to get your insight into what that represents. And again, that question of prevalence, like how much of this is out there?
Yeah, this language is very specific. So in the far-right groups, most of them have very active Facebook groups, some less so since they've been banned by Facebook, but the language of treason is a common occurrence across the spectrum. And I want to also contextualize this for people, because this is not just a word that stands on its own. So in many of these posts and in this landscape, treason is closely followed by the idea of capital punishment. So posts will surface saying that somebody's a traitor and they should face the death penalty. These are things that are synonymous in a lot of these groups. So we need to take that context. Even though this individual didn't go so far as to say that, that is the context in which this language most often occurs in the far right.
And what about the targeting of the Prime Minister with that language?
Yeah, the Prime Minister is a very common target. There's a visceral hatred for the Prime Minister in the far right in general, and in Soldiers of Odin, in 3%ers, in the Yellow Vests. And it's very specific, very directed at the Prime Minister. Other cabinet ministers also get a little bit of that backlash, but nothing quite so much as the Prime Minister.
And what about the concept of rehabilitation? I was listening very closely to what Murray said, and we don't have a lot of answers from the military, but what we do know is that this individual was interviewed, there was some sort of counterintelligence effort made years ago, and yet, he still is where he is type of thing. These individuals still are where they are. And my initial question is, well, how could that be, right? And Murray suggested that one possibility, and we don't know because we don't have the answers, but a possibility is maybe there was some effort to rehabilitate. Are those efforts, do they exist? Do they work? Is there any evidence to tell us either of the answers to those questions?
Yeah, this really gets into the whole de-radicalization conversation writ large. And the studies on that are really mixed. In some very specific contexts, there do seem to be some programs aimed at rehabilitation and reintegration that have had some success, but fundamentally, you can't change someone's mind and their ideas unless they want to change it themselves. So there may be some rehabilitation programs in which members have expressed remorse for their participation in these groups, have been very genuine about that, and then they can take steps to reintegrate them into the Canadian military or back into society. But in many cases, if that remorse isn't genuine, you cannot force the issue. So those efforts will be wasted.
Okay, I have to leave it there. I'm out of time, but I've learned a lot through this. I appreciate it so much. Thanks, Jessica.
My pleasure, Vashi.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.